The ancient Greeks speculated there must be a southern continent to balance out the top-heavy northern hemisphere. The term Antarcticos, or Antarctic, was coined in the 2nd century AD by a Greek geographer, cartographer, and mathematician as the opposite of Arctos, or the Great Bear constellation found above the North Pole. Now, of course, we know these as the North Star and the Big Dipper. But it would be more than 2,000 years before man had concrete evidence of the existence of Terra Australis Incognita, or the unknown southern land. There have been many scouts and scouters, such as Paul Seipel and Richard Lee Chappell, with ties to adventures in Antarctica. Let's learn more about the history of Antarctica and a special medal and square knot that can be earned by those that have spent any time directly supporting or conducting research at the bottom of the Earth in this edition of Artifact of the Week. A 2021 study published in the Journal of the Royal Society of New Zealand used oral histories, artwork, and other historical reports to conclude that Polynesian explorers may have discovered Antarctica about 1,000 years before Western European explorers started to leave their shores to discover the world. Among the European explorers, there was a belief that the bottom of the Earth was a tropical landmass or a group of islands filled with riches. Another belief is that the bottom of the Earth was connected to South America or Africa through land bridges. Now, during the 15th and 16th centuries, explorers like Magellan rounded the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn to dispel the notion of land bridges connecting this unknown land to the known world. And in the late 1700s, British explorer Captain James Cook circumnavigated the southern oceans during a 2-year expedition, battling thick pack ice, fog, and bad weather in search of Antarctica before giving up and returning home to England, where they concluded that if Antarcticos was there, it was farther south, covered with ice, and virtually inaccessible. Despite never actually having seen Antarctica, Cook and his crew became the first ship to record crossing the Antarctic Circle on January 17, 1773. The honor of being the first to see the continent would fall on Russian explorer Captain Thaddeus von Bellinghausen in January of 1820. At about the same time, a British Royal Navy officer, Edward Bransfield, also reportedly saw the continent during a mapping expedition. Despite grim reports of the conditions in Antarctica and the oceans in the area, many sealers and whalers headed to the Antarctic region in search of rich hunting grounds. In order to protect their most lucrative hunting locations, these expeditions rarely provided any new knowledge of the region. On January 24, 1895, 7 men from a whaling and sealing ship called Antarctic made the first recorded landing on Antarctica. While which of the 7 men was the first to actually step off the boat and onto the continent is in dispute, one of these men, a Norwegian explorer named Borchgrevink, returned to Antarctica in 1899, leading the first British expedition to spend a winter on the Antarctic mainland. This expedition ushered in what is known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, spanning the first 20 years of the 20th century. Names associated with the heroic era include Scott, Shackleton, Wilson, and Amundsen. British naval officer and explorer Robert Scott attempted twice to reach the South Pole. First in 1902, when he was forced to abandon his attempt, and a second attempt in 1911, where his team successfully reached the South Pole in January of 1912, about a month after Norwegian explorer Amundsen became the first person to reach the South Pole in December of 1911. While Amundsen successfully returned from his trip, Scott's team perished on their way back from the pole. The next significant Antarctic challenge was an overland crossing of the continent to see if there was in fact a channel that connected the Ross and Weddell Seas as some believe existed. Anglo-Irish explorer Ernest Shackleton organized the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition in 1914. This 1,800-mile expedition failed when Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, became trapped in the pack ice and eventually sank in October of 1915. Shackleton and his crew were able to salvage gear, provisions, and lifeboats from the Endurance and made their way to Elephant Island in April of 1916. Shackleton and 5 of his crew of 28 used the lifeboats to make a perilous 800-mile journey to a whaling station on the island of South George, where they found people and a ship they used to save the rest of the crew. Incredibly, all 28 crew members survived. The wreck of the Endurance was rediscovered in 2022 by searchers using robotic underwater vehicles. Menson Bound, director of the expedition that found the Endurance, said, "This is by far the finest wooden shipwreck I have ever seen. It's upright, well proud of the seabed, intact and in a brilliant state of preservation. You can even see the name Endurance arced across the stern." Shackleton died of a heart attack in January of 1922 while at the whaling village on the island of South George during his final expedition to Antarctica. Shackleton's death at the age of 42 brought an end to the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. In the 1920s, scientific exploration becomes the new focus of expeditions to Antarctica. In 1929, Admiral Richard Byrd takes his first of 5 expeditions on the continent, and the 1929 trip is notable because Byrd flies over much of Antarctica doing aerial surveys and photo mapping. His expedition also helps to establish advanced radio communications on the continent. This is also the trip where Paul Seipel, an Eagle Scout, is chosen to accompany the expedition. It will be the first of 5 Byrd expeditions that Seipel participates in. The first woman to set foot on Antarctica is Caroline Mikkelsen, the wife of a Norwegian whaling captain who accompanied her husband to the continent in 1935. In 1947, the U.S. Navy launches Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition ever undertaken, involving over 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 23 aircraft. 1956 marks the return of people to the South Pole when a U.S. aircraft lands there. These are the first people to go to the pole since Scott reached there in 1912. 1957 marks 40 years since Shackleton's second attempt to cross Antarctica and the first successful land crossing led by British geologist Vivian Fuchs with New Zealander Edmund Hillary leading the backup party. 1957 and 58 are designated the International Geophysical Year, which is led by Eagle Scout Paul Seipel, who brings along another Eagle Scout, Richard Lee Chappell, as part of this international scientific expedition, uniting 12 nations in the establishment of 60 scientific and communication stations across the continent. While 1957 marks the beginning of the non-nationalization of Antarctica, it is 1961 when the Antarctic Treaty comes into effect. 12 nations initially enter into the treaty to use Antarctica for peaceful purposes only and suspend territorial claims. By 2019, there are 54 signatories. In 1997, a Norwegian, Bjørge Osland, becomes the first person to cross Antarctica unsupported. Osland uses skis and a sail, towing a 400-pound sled, and completes the trip in 64 days. 2007 to 2009 are designated the International Polar Year. The designation covers 2 years to enable researchers the opportunity to work in both polar regions or to work in both the summer and winter seasons. To recognize the participation and contributions of U.S. military personnel in expeditions to Antarctica between 1928 and 1941, 3 commemorative medals were issued: the Byrd Antarctic Expedition Medal, the Second Byrd Expedition Medal, and the United States Antarctic Expedition Medal. On July 7, 1960, the Antarctica Service Medal was established to replace the 3 previous military medals and was made retroactive to all eligible individuals back to January 1, 1946. While the new ASM was intended as a military award for the U.S. Armed Forces issued in the name of the Department of Defense, it may also be awarded to U.S. civilians and citizens of foreign nations invited to participate in scientific research with a participating U.S. agency like the National Science Foundation. After July 1, 1973, the award recognizes 30 days of assigned duty at sea or ashore south of latitude 60 degrees. It also is awarded for 15 days of assigned duty at an outlying station on the continent. Starting July 1, 1987, flight crews providing logistics support from outside of the Antarctic area were awarded the medal after 15 missions. The Antarctic Service Medal, which the U.S. Mint designed, is a gold disc. On the front is the figure of a man in Antarctic clothing with his hood thrown back, arms extended, hands closed, and legs spread to symbolize stability, determination, courage, and devotion. The figure stands on broken ground with clouds in the background and mountains in the far distance. The reverse shows a polar projection map of the Antarctic continent with the words courage, sacrifice, devotion set across in 3 centered lines. all with a symbolic border of penguins and marine life. The medal is suspended from a ribbon that has a black stripe on each edge and graded from a white stripe in the center to pale blue, light blue, greenish blue, and medium blue. The outer bands of black and dark blue represent the 5 months of the Antarctic darkness. The center portion symbolizes 7 months of solar illumination and also the aurora australis. For those that winter over on the continent, there are 3 devices that can be added to the medal. A bronze device indicates the first award, gold represents the second award, and silver represents the third award. In addition to the ASM, the BSA and the National Science Foundation awards a certificate and a square knot to registered scouts and scouters that participate in research operations in Antarctica. The white square knot represents the ice and snow that covers 95% of the surface of the continent. The blue background represents the bodies of water that surround the land, and the black border represents the longitudinal lines that converge at the South Pole. You can see both the Antarctica Service Award and the NSF BSA Square Knot on display here at the National Scouting Museum. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Join us next time as we continue to learn more about the history of the BSA through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.